Hi, I'm Amanda Nesheiwat, and I'm guest hosting the Green Revolution Show. I'm here today with Dr. Mann, the climate scientist who created the famous hockey stick graph showing the massive rise of temperatures in our atmosphere, which revolutionized the way that we communicate about climate change. Dr. Mann is an author and distinguished professor of atmospheric science at Penn State. He was named by Scientific American as one of the 50 leading visionaries in science and technology. He contributed with other IPCC authors to the award of the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. Bloomberg News ranked him as one of the 50 most influential people in 2013. Dr. Mann, thank you for being on our show.
Thank you, Amanda. Great to be with you.
We want to just kind of get to know you a little bit, and we wanted to ask, what put you on the path to becoming a climate scientist to begin with?
Well, you know, I always loved science from the earliest days I can remember. When I was a young child, I was just fascinated about the way things work, the way the world works, the way the universe, why it's the way it is. And so I was always interested in science and math, and I went off to UC Berkeley to study applied math and physics. Ended up deciding to pursue a PhD in theoretical physics at Yale University, and sort of was all but dissertation. I'd done all, passed all my exams, was ready to do my PhD research. When I sort of had a crisis of scientific identity, I just didn't think that what I was doing was what I was meant to do for the rest of my life. And so I started looking elsewhere around the university to see what other sorts of science was being done where the math and physics that I had learned could be brought to bear, where I could contribute something. And I saw that there was a professor in the Department of Geology and Geophysics who was modeling Earth's climate system. And that sounded fascinating to me, so I went and talked with him. The rest, as they say, is history. I decided to pursue my PhD in climate science and went on to do a postdoctoral research fellowship where I actually did the research that led to the so-called hockey stick curve.
Oh, okay. Well, that's an interesting story. Well, oftentimes scientists are bogged down by, research and teaching, but for the past maybe 20 years or so, you've been sort of a public advocate, a public figure in the climate, field, and we just kind of wanted to know why, what motivates you to do that?
Yeah, well, it's funny. So when we published the hockey stick curve back in 1998, literally 20 years ago, it had its 20th birthday on Earth Day this year.
Oh.
It was published in the journal Nature on April 22nd, 1998, and then we had a follow-up article a year later which extended the hockey stick back 1,000 years. And that sort of became an iconic image in the climate change debate. So I found myself, whether I liked it or not, at the center of this very contentious societal debate over human-caused climate change.
Mm-hmm.
I was subject to attacks by those looking to discredit my research, often by trying to discredit me personally. So you might say I didn't really have a choice. I was sort of forced into the spotlight, but ultimately I have come to embrace the role that has provided me, even though it's not what I signed up for. When I double majored in applied math and physics, I didn't think I would be spending my life, in a contentious political debate. But ultimately I've come to embrace the opportunity this has given me to inform this larger societal conversation over what is arguably the greatest challenge we've ever faced as a civilization.
Yes, absolutely. Well, so you've actually given us a lot of research that has revolutionized the climate movement over the past few years. And you've spoken a lot about climate skeptics. And I wanted to ask you personally, why do you think so many Americans don't believe in climate change or believe how dangerous it is for us?
Yeah, so and we don't even like to use the term skeptic to describe the climate change deniers,
yes,
contrarians,
deniers.
Because skepticism is a good thing in science. Good faith skepticism is sort of the self-correcting machinery of science, as the great Carl Sagan used to say. But what we're talking about here aren't real skeptics. These are pseudo-skeptics. They're contrarians. They're rejecting the overwhelming scientific evidence based on the flimsiest of arguments that don't hold up to the slightest bit of scrutiny, and that's anything but skepticism. Unfortunately, there are powerful vested interests, fossil fuel interests in particular, that do not want to see us transition away from our reliance on fossil fuels because they lose out. When we move past fossil fuels, we move on to embrace renewable energy. the most powerful industry in the world, the fossil fuel industry, sees itself as losing out. And too often they have engaged certain fossil fuel companies and front groups that they have supported, funded, rather than engaging in a legitimate debate about what do we do about this problem, have tried to fool the public and policymakers into thinking that there isn't a problem at all. It's the same playbook that the tobacco industry used decades ago. Some of the same actors, some of the same individuals who acted as sort of spokespeople for the tobacco industry, denying the science linking tobacco and lung cancer, are today working for the fossil fuel industry, denying those linkages. There's a famous quote attributed to Upton Sinclair, who once said, "It's very difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it."
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're dealing with here.
Well, I think our viewers would like to know what your thoughts are on what you think needs to happen to our current political climate to take the necessary action we so need at this very important time.
Yeah, well, we need to have a discussion. I mean, there's a worthy debate to be had about what do we do about this problem? What sorts of policies do we put in place to act on climate before, we commit to truly dangerous planetary climate change? That means we need policymakers who are willing to represent our interests, what's right for the people, rather than the special interests who too often fund their campaigns, particularly fossil fuel interests who have literally spent tens of millions of dollars on a disinformation campaign to fool the public and policymakers about the reality and threat of climate change. And too often we find that our politicians who take money from the fossil fuel industry engage in what is really a bad faith rejection of the overwhelming evidence. It's not that they don't get it. In most cases, they get it. They're smart enough. A lot of them went to prestigious universities, and they understand the problem. It's just that they're unwilling to sort of act in a way that might disappoint or be inconvenient to the fossil fuel interests who fund their campaigns. We, the people, have this remarkable power where we can vote. If we feel that our politicians are not representing our interests, we can show up at the voting booth, we can vote them out, and we can vote in politicians who will be willing to do something. We have an upcoming election here in the U.S. Where we can signal that we want to go in a new direction, that we don't like the fact that our Congress is controlled by climate change deniers, Republican leadership, or you might say a lack of leadership, a Republican Congress that refuses to even recognize the reality of the problem, and a president who denies that climate change is real, working hand in hand with the Republican Congress that has enabled his denial and his efforts to delay action on climate.
It seems like they're paid off, many of them. A little bit before the interview, you were talking with me about some research that you had just recently come out with. Can you explain a little bit about it?
Sure thing. So we've been studying the impact that climate change is having on extreme weather events. And there's some relationships that we understand very well. You warm up the oceans, you're going to evaporate more moisture. So you get larger amounts of rainfall with these tropical storms, and we've seen that in recent years, more flooding events. You warm up the ground, you evaporate more moisture. It's actually the same physical relationship, so you get worse drought. You warm up the planet, well, obviously you're going to get more high temperature extremes. You're going to get longer and more frequent heat waves. So these are things we understand fairly well, but there's also a subtle impact that we now think climate change is having on these extreme weather events. It's literally changing the behavior of the jet stream, this band of winds that blows from west to east in the middle latitudes across the entire northern hemisphere. And the jet stream moves weather systems along with it. One of the things that's happening is as we warm the Arctic region even more than the rest of the planet because we're melting all that ice, we call this Arctic amplification. We end up reducing the contrast in temperature from the warm subtropics to the cold polar region. Because we're warming the poles so much, we reduce that contrast. Well, that temperature contrast is actually the reason for the existence of the jet stream in the first place. Okay. So we slow down the jet stream, and we cause it to sort of meander more broadly, in the same way that a river that's traveling over flat land tends to exhibit these very wide, sort of back and forth, side to side meanders. The jet stream is sort of the same way. When you slow it down, you get these large meanders, and the larger those meanders, the larger what we call the ridges and the troughs in those wave patterns, the bigger high pressure systems and low pressure systems we have at the surface. And those are weather systems. High pressure gives you heat, it gives you drought, it gives you wildfire. Low pressure gives you excessive rainfall. And this summer, for example, we saw this high pressure, this ridge parked over California for days on end, leading to unprecedented heat and drought and unprecedented wildfires. Whereas back east, we had the flip side. It's the ridge out west, and then we had the trough, sort of the southern meander of that wave in the eastern U.S., which gave us unprecedented rainfall. Similarly, if you look at Eurasia, unprecedented heat wave in Europe, unprecedented flooding in Japan, that was all related to this very unusual pattern in the jet stream where it slows down and it just sort of meanders. You see this very high amplitude waviness to the jet stream gives us these extreme weather patterns, and it remains in the same place for long stretches of time. One of the things that's interesting is the climate models that we use to project forward and to analyze the impact that climate change is already having on our weather. They don't actually capture this process, or they certainly don't capture it accurately enough. So we had to use an indirect way to look at this problem. We had to combine the models with observational data, where we know we can trust the observational relationships. And this study tells us sort of what we already suspected, that climate change is leading to this unusual jet stream pattern, which is giving us unprecedented extremes like we saw in this extreme summer of 2018. And here's the cautionary note. The climate models are underestimating the impact climate change is having on these weather extremes because they don't capture this mechanism that we're talking about. So it's sort of another cautionary tale. When you talk about the science of climate change, sometimes you hear the critics say, well, there's uncertainty in the science, so why should we act? Well, uncertainty isn't our friend because it's actually cutting against us. As we learn more, as we discover processes that we didn't understand, that aren't well captured in the models, we're seeing that things can happen faster than we thought. The ice sheets are starting to lose ice faster than they were predicted to, which is contributing to sea level rise earlier than we expected. And now here with extreme weather events, there's this linkage with the behavior of the jet stream that we didn't understand. And now as we begin to understand it better, we realize that we may be in for far worse increases in these disastrous weather extremes like we saw this summer in the future if we don't act quickly enough, if we don't bring down those carbon emissions and stabilize warming below dangerous levels.
Yes, absolutely. So what do we know now with this newfound understanding of our jet streams and what's happening with it? How is that really affecting the everyday person?
So, I mean, we talk about dangerous climate change. When does it happen? 2 degrees Celsius warming of the planet, 1.5 degrees Celsius warming of the planet. Well, we're already at 1 degree Celsius warming of the planet, about 1.5 Fahrenheit warming of the planet. And arguably, dangerous climate change has already arrived. If you're Puerto Rico, dangerous climate change has arrived. If you're California, dangerous climate change has arrived. If you're Miami Beach, if you're the coast of North Carolina, dangerous climate change has arrived. If you're a low-lying island nation, dangerous climate change has arrived. It's simply a question of how bad are we willing to let it get. And again, summer 2018 was the summer where the impacts of climate change were no longer subtle. We saw them play out on our television screens, in our newspaper headlines, in our social media feeds. The impacts have become profound. They're not subtle. And if you look at California, the loss of life, the damage to property, the destruction of the forests, and you look at the devastation that was suffered by North Carolina this year with Florence, a record flooding event. Actually, it was the second worst flooding event on record in the United States.
Wow.
The worst flooding event in the United States was last year.
Okay.
That was Hurricane Harvey.
Okay.
The worst flooding event in American history. So the two worst flooding events, and the people who were displaced by that, the people who lost homes, and some people perished from the impacts of these storms. And of course, the poster child, let's not forget that Puerto Rico, these are American citizens, and this was the worst, you could call it a natural disaster, but maybe we shouldn't anymore. This was a disaster that was heightened by the impact of human activity, by climate change. The worst natural disaster in American history, a massive loss of life. They lost power and drinking water for the better part of a year. This is the face of climate change. It's not subtle.
Not taking action on climate change is very dangerous, but it's also very costly.
No, that's right. The critics like to say, oh, it's going to cost too much to act on this problem. But the cost of inaction is already way more than the cost of actually taking action. And if we need a reminder of that, look at the billions of dollars that we have suffered in economic losses, forgetting about the devastation to people's lives and the loss of life, even if you only care about the bottom line of our economy. The cost of the damage that has been done by these unprecedented extreme weather events, like Superstorm Sandy, where climate change, in fact, sea level rise alone added several $billions to the damage, which was somewhere in the range of $60 billion overall. But several $billions of that damage was due to sea level rise alone, and that's not even taking into account the other ways that that storm was amplified by climate change. If you look at the devastation in California, the loss of crops and livestock in the Midwest, the drought and heat wave of 2011, Texas ranchers lost 25% of their cattle. That's the cost of inaction, and it's far greater than the cost of taking action. In fact, some would argue that taking action is sort of a no regrets sort of economic decision anyways. Moving away from dirty fossil fuels, which are destroying our environment, towards renewable energy, where there's so much potential for growth, economic growth. Right, it's a
Cleaner
win-win.
air, safer jobs, a better economy.
Exactly. I think that really gets at the problem here. But we, the people, can show up at the voting booth and vote in politicians who recognize that this is a real problem and are willing to act on it. And this is an amazing opportunity we have coming up. Maybe to put Congress back in the hands of a party that's willing to act on climate and is willing to act as a check on a president who refuses to act on climate.
Right, that's right. That's why it's important to go vote.
Absolutely.
Well, it's great to hear you say that, because a lot of young people are very discouraged with what's happening right now, and the kind of inaction that's happening from our administration. Do you think that we could still do something with our current president? And do you have any advice for young people on how to stay engaged and involved without feeling disheartened by it all?
Yeah, I've been really encouraged by the youth of our country over the last, couple of years. Sort of in the era of Trump, I think we've really seen a reawakening of the voice of the youth of this country when it comes to issues like gun violence, and increasingly when it comes to the issue of climate change. There is a movement, it's called the 0 Hour, and these are high school kids who realize that this is about their future, that we are making policy decisions now that are going to impact them and their children and their grandchildren, and if we want to save their future, we have to act on this problem now. Too often, these folks, in the case of high school kids, they're too young to vote, but they're not too young to make their voice heard and to try to put appropriate pressure on the adults in their lives to vote on this issue, because it's about, if you're an adult, it's about your children, it's about your grandchildren, it's about not leaving behind a degraded planet for the future generations. That's why it's so important to vote, and I think young people, I think the youth of this country get that. They've become so politically active now over the last couple of years, and I am hopeful that they're going to go out and vote. I've been doing everything within my power to try to convince them to do that, that this is our best opportunity to shape our future by showing up at the polling booth and putting in place politicians who will act on our behalf rather than on behalf of polluting interests.
That's right. Take back the power.
Absolutely.